You are now listening to Soundspace, the podcast where we interview experts and professionals in the space of sound.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Soundspace, the podcast where we talk to music and audio professionals. I am once again joined by my amazing co-hosts, Anthony and Anthony. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm doing so good. This episode is going to be an incredible treat for all of you. This is a big deal for Anthony and I. This is the first time we have a professor of ours coming on the podcast. It's truly a fantastic episode and a landmark for us. So Please let me introduce to you Michael Pinsonneault. He is a songwriter, composer, sound designer, writer, educator, and musical performer based in Montreal, Quebec. His education includes a DEC in jazz performance and arranging from Vanier College, a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Electroacoustics, music education, music theory and composition, jazz improvisation, classical and jazz performance at Concordia University, a Master of Arts in musicology focusing on the history of African American musical and performing styles in Canada at Université de Montréal, and lastly, a Ph.D. focusing on music in mainstream films. He has taught songwriting and sound synthesis at Trebas Institute, music technology at John Abbott College, music theory at Vanier College, workshops in computer and music for children at the Catholic School Board of Montreal, soundtrack composition, music recording, production, arranging, MIDI, synthesis, sampling, sequencers, computer-assisted musical notation at Music Technique College, sound recording, sound production, sound design for film and interactive media, electroacoustic composition, sound for artists, multi-channel composition, and electroacoustic creative practices at Concordia University. His professional activities have included Bug Alley, a vocal jazz group that was Grammy-nominated, Virtual Memoir, a full-length novel with a connected concept album, Macbeth, where he undertook the original music, musical direction, and performance, Fragments of Knowing, a performance art installation piece, Pinsinneault, a painting exhibition that he composed music and a short portion of audio for. Furthermore, his discography spans over 20 credits as a performer, producer, and executive producer. Lastly, he has sound designed short films such as The Chaperone 3D and You Ever Hear About the Toad. Please welcome Michael Pinsonneault. How are you, Michael?
Great to be here. Great to be talking to you guys.
Great to have you.
Nice to see you again. Yeah.
So nice to see you.
It's so nice to see you. Thank you so much for coming on. We have quite a bit to get to because your career spans multiple decades with fantastic experiences that I think our listeners can really benefit from. So I really want to just start with an introductory question with you, just to know, when did music and sound become of importance to you, and what was that experience like for you?
Right. Well, I had music in one side of my family. I come from a mixed Irish-Canadian and French-Canadian background. And on my mother's side, her grandmother was an absolutely amazing musician, virtuoso pianist, violinist, organist, and that passed along to my mother, who was like an amazing reader of music and so on. And so it was kind of in the bloodline there. But I never really took to music till my teens because they went the usual route and sent me to the neighborhood piano teacher. And she was kind of a mean lady, and I didn't really I was 6 years old, and I could have been one of those kids who just learned to play piano from the age of 6 and been really great when I was in my teens. But in retrospect, I was glad I said, nah, I don't want to go anymore. And my parents, let me stop the lessons. And then when I was in my teens, I had friends in high school who had formed a little jam band, and I went over and just picked up the flute because that was a kind of instrument that they didn't have. They all played the guitar. And then the race was on. I just really wanted to know as much and learn as much about music as I possibly could. And it was kind of like magic for me for the first couple of years because I didn't have really much training. And when I finally got to Cégep and started to learn how to read music, it was like I was understanding what was happening. But I clearly remember that feeling in my teens of music just being magical, of listening to Jethro Tull albums and Frank Zappa albums in my teens. And it was just like, wow, this thing of music was absolutely incredible. So that's kind of how it started, and it's never stopped ever since.
Very cool.
That is amazing. Yeah. So from there, when did you decide to want to go start studying music? How did that proceed into your academic side?
Well, okay, so after the high school experience of just picking up music and learning to play by ear and all those kind of things, I just decided to take music as an elective in my first year of Cégep. In those days, people who lived on the West Island had to go into Vanier, and there wasn't really a music program at John Abbott yet, and I'm not even sure, I don't think John Abbott had really started up their programs when I was there.
Wow. Very cool. Wow.
So went into Vanier and took music as a sixth course in my regular kind of load. And at one point, the teacher took me aside and said, you should consider coming here in music because you seem to have quite a bit of talent. And I said, wow. And it was the first time anybody had given me that kind of encouragement, really. So I decided,
that's a nice encouragement.
next time I went in, I, decided, I'm going to make the switch. I talked to him. And after that, I did 3 consecutive years there of like the most amazing musical training one could ever ask for because they had great teachers there in those days. And the whole basis of my musicianship is in that school.
So you go through Vanier and then eventually Concordia happens. And Concordia is a big topic of conversation, obviously, for this episode because that is where we met you. That is where you taught us. And that is where you still teach to this day. But you did the Bachelor's of Fine Arts and Electroacoustic Studies, and you also went a lot into jazz there. What was that experience like jumping from Vanier to Concordia?
Well, Vanier was foundational, right? You would go in there 5 full classes, full days of classes a week, and every morning you'd be sitting in an ear training class that would go on for 90 minutes, and then you'd move on to these other courses. Really just wiring your brain for music, really learning how to hear it, how to sing it, how to conduct it, all those kind of things. And after that experience, I was ready for other things. I mean, I did the 3rd year specialization at Vanier that taught me arranging skills and had all this playing experience at that point. So by the time I got to Concordia, it was really just the very beginning of the music department. And it had a visionary founder named Phil Cohen that a lot of students now don't really have a memory of because he sort of left the department years ago, did other things at Concordia, and now has passed away. But he was just such an inspiring figure that I always remember his classes and just the infectiousness of the love that he had for music. So that part of it was just super positive. And like I said, it was at the very beginning. Operated out of a few little buildings on Bishop Street downtown in those days. And it was only in my 2nd year that everything moved out to the Loyola campus when it suddenly had all of these classrooms just of its own. And it could spread out and have practice rooms for the students and all these kind of things that didn't exist. So kind of being in on the ground floor of a department like Concordia was really kind of a cool experience because there were new people being hired all over the place. A couple of full-time professors from the States came up into the jazz program and had this wonderful composition teacher, Alan Crossman. So just the combination of people I worked with was terrific during those years and just also a lot of really great experiences. Like one that I remember was they brought a jazz ensemble that I was playing in out to do kind of a community service gig. And one of the new guys who'd come up to teach from the States said, it's this minimum security prison outside of Montreal that says they could, really enjoy having some jazz music for the prisoners there. And we said, well, okay, sounds all right. So we hopped in a van and on the way out, someone thought to ask, well, what is this place actually called? And he says, Archambault. And suddenly our jaws dropped because it's the most notorious maximum security prison in Quebec. And there'd just been this riot the week before and people got killed. And suddenly we're going out to Archambault and, rolling through the gates and having all our stuff x-rayed. And then we go into this little chapel and we set up and then they let the prisoners in. And these were, all guys who were on the best behavior, which is why they got the treat. These guys shuffle in, they're all looking at the floor, they plop down in their seats and then we start to play for them. And this is one of my musical peak moments of my life is just the vibe in that room, the expression on their faces when we played live music for those people cooped up in the pen was just incredible in the end. So those kind of things happened in those days, in universities, you could sort of have experiences like that you weren't kind of protected from. Plus, I was working full-time as a professional musician in my band Bug Alley, which I think you're going to ask me about later. Definitely. So it was kind of like a working life as a musician accompanied by this inspiring education. So terrific experience.
That is absolutely incredible. And, terrifying at the same time, but very cool experience. And so from there, after you graduated from Concordia, you went on and do a master's in musicology on the history of African-American musical and performing styles at Université de Montréal. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that seems like such a really interesting subject.
Yeah, well, I made it up myself. It's what I wanted to do, and I figured nobody else had probably done it yet. So what happened was, I had been out of school for a little while. I was working as a teacher and all that, and I just started to get restless. Like, I wanted to kind of learn some more stuff. So I started to take elective courses at the Université de Montréal. I took a great ethnomusicology course with a teacher that I, went on to study with during my master's. But that sort of led to me, kind of at a certain moment in time saying, well, I think it's time for me to do my master's now. So I went down to another university in Montreal, which shall remain unnamed because the experience wasn't very positive there. I walked in and I said, well, I'd like to do my master's. Right. And they sort of looked at my manuscript from Concordia and they said, well, you're pretty much going to have to do your bachelor's over again before we would consider, letting you study at the master's level here. So I said, okay, well, I'm not doing that.
That's
not doing
crazy.
that.
No
So
way.
I went down and I got an appointment with someone at Université de Montréal, sat down with the woman who eventually became my master's advisor, who headed the musicology department of the faculty there. We sat down. I had sort of formulated this idea of, everybody talks about African-American music. We all know jazz, and people who study jazz know ragtime and the early forms of jazz and all these things. But I can't help but wondering, what exactly was happening in Canada all those years. And some people have written histories of music and popular music in Canada, but I said, what about a real focus? Like, go right back to the beginning. And was there slave music here? Because there were slaves in French Canada and in some in Lower Canada as well. And did they have any forms of music that evolved? I went back to the very beginning and then went through all the different periods. What was ragtime like up here? What was early jazz? And on from there. And that was my topic. So this advisor at Université de Montréal really liked it, saying, okay, you take a course or two in methodology so you know how we do things here, and good to go, let's go. And it was like a time in the 80s when they were really trying to reduce the amount of time people spent in the various universities doing their degrees. So she said, listen, you're going to have 100-page limit on your thesis. And if you can do that and all the courses and everything in a 2-year span, that would be great. And I said, perfect, that suits me just fine. And that's exactly what it was. Exactly 2 years from start to finish to do my MA. Took all of these great seminars. One was on Balinese music. They had just purchased a whole Balinese gamelan, that amazing set of instruments that the orchestras over in Bali play. And they had a resident Balinese gamelan master there who co-taught the seminar. So really great stuff like that. And another one on 20th century art and music that was an absolute blast because it was kind of like a group project at the end. That was our sort of collective final paper, and we had essentially a Dada soiree at a friend of mine's loft on Saint Laurent Street and just invited people, and we just had skit after skit after skit on our research and what we were doing, but in that kind of format of what would have been happening in the early 20th century of Dada art. So great memories, and at the end of it all, I did so well that I kind of placed first for doctoral funding in all of Quebec. So that was a really nice, liftoff. I really liked my teachers, and they really liked me. And it's always a treat to teach a mature student, and that's what I was at that point, of course. And it just was a super positive experience leading up to my doctorate some years later.
Absolutely.
And as far as the topic goes, it was just literally something I wanted to do. Can't get better than that, right? Like, this is what I want to do. And someone says, yeah, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Come use our faculty to do your, realize your idea. That's fantastic.
Right. So you leave Concordia to go to UDEM, but ultimately you do come back to Concordia to do a Ph.D. focusing on music and mainstream films, as I said in the intro. But literally a decade later, based on your resume, let's get into that. Why going back to Concordia? Why such a long gap between the two? Really, I'd love to know all of that.
Sure. Well, I was working as a teacher, right? So to me, there wasn't any huge drive to get to the doctoral level. I was always a bit of a reluctant participant in academia. I always knew I was much more of a practical person. And, I always had a lively mind and great curiosity about learning and all those things. But the fact was, I wasn't racing to get a full-time tenured faculty position at that point. It really wasn't in my planning, because I was already teaching and doing a combination of projects and teaching, and that seemed to suit me pretty well. But again, it was just the restlessness set in. I hadn't learned anything new in a school setting for a long time, so I said, maybe I'm just going to try to do my doctorate here. And so I found out from friends about this interdisciplinary doctorate that they were starting to offer just for the first times at Concordia in those years. And it allowed you basically to propose a topic and to recruit 3 advisors in 3 different departments, and that would constitute an interdisciplinary PhD in the humanities. So I said, okay. And my sound design life had been evolving for a little while, and I said, well, what if I just, kind of put a little bit of weight on the gas here and actually learn more about sound design through my doctoral work? So I said, I want to do it on the social aspects of Hollywood film music. We all hear the music in those classic old films from the 30s and 40s and early 50s. But where did these people come from? Who did they study with? What was their training?
Right.
What was their kind of musical background that made it so that that was Hollywood film music? Because there's always reasons for it, right? It's not, someone's not sitting making a centralized decision of let's make it this kind of music. It's all about the composers. And they all came from Eastern Europe, and they all studied with specific people and were very schooled in certain kinds of late romantic work, like by Richard Strauss and Wagner and people like that. And so they ended up bringing all that training with them to Hollywood when some of them emigrated for various reasons. And that became the film music. So my thesis just dug into that of like, what was that music like? And here's an example and how it can be prepared to this kind of late romantic music and all those kinds of things. And it was a great experience. Like any doctorate, it took a while. I was in for 7 years doing it. And then it's just sort of sat on my resume ever since as something that, you know, comes in handy once in a while when you need to say that you got a doctorate, right?
Very handy, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and the president of Concordia currently is Graham Carr, and he was my external reader on my doctorate defense. So I remember seeing him when he was provost a little while ago, and it was at some kind of social function. I said, hey, probably don't remember this, but remember a doctorate that you read? He says, oh, the one on film music? Yeah, this guy, Michael Pinsonneault. So he didn't recognize who I was, but he actually remembered what I'd written, right? So anyway,
that's amazing.
That was Concordia.
Okay.
That's great.
Very cool.
So
Very cool.
While you started your Ph.D., you were obviously working at the time. You were teaching at Musitechnique College. How were you able to manage a work school life?
Well, the whole teaching thing for me was, it had a very particular kind of origin that's maybe worth talking about for a second before I get into the balance, you know? So the thing about teaching for me is it kind of came at a time when I was working full-time as a musician. I had this band, Bug Alley, that was doing really well. We were just working all the time, doing TV, radio, you name it. It was all sort of happening for this band. It was one of the really kind of seminal jazz ensembles of the 1970s. But I just came to this decision in my early 20s that I just couldn't take the life of a full-time musician in that sense. Because in those days, you were constantly touring. You know, just you do all these little gigs all over Quebec in tiny places. And because of the nature of our band, it was a groundbreaking band. I mean, we would be playing in venues that only ever featured rock music, for example. And yet we'd walk in there and somehow, you know, this entertaining jazz evening was supposed to be what people in the place liked. And you didn't know how it was going to go from time to time. So I was the leader of the group, and it was really great because there were such talented musicians, such an amazing opportunity, not only for playing, but for writing. It just really developed my songwriting technique in its early stages and my ability to put lyrics to existing tunes and things that I'm still doing now all came from that time. So when I decided to go into teaching, I said, I can't do this all the time. I'd like to keep music in my life. I'd like to keep doing projects, but I want it to be more on my terms. And so that's when I started interviewing for jobs. And that happened to be the year 1979 when the Trebas Institute was opening up, the very first version of it, the very first recording arts school in all of Canada, actually. And so this guy, for some reason, kind of liked my background. I mean, I only had my bachelor's in those days, but still, he sort of liked my ideas and all the rest of it. So I just started my teaching career. And, you know, of necessity, I was always in kind of small teaching cohorts. So there would be maybe 5, 6, 7 teachers in the whole school. And so you could arrange stuff around scheduling. You could say, listen, you know, I've got this thing to do. So if your studies are going on at the same time, which they were for me at the doctoral level, I just say to the people, listen, I've got classes on these days. Don't schedule me next term for those times. And everyone was fine because they didn't have hundreds and hundreds of teachers to think about like they do at the university. These were small places. So I was able to do that balance, and I'd been teaching already for a number of years, so I had my courses largely together, and so I could concentrate my mind largely on what I was learning at school and just go on teaching and doing my thing at the school at the same time. And I didn't ever find it too much of a strain in those days.
Right.
Okay.
Naturally.
Right. Very interesting. And I was wanting to know, obviously you taught so many different people over the years and you've met thousands of students, I would venture to say. What's the biggest lesson that you learned over the decades that you've taught music and sound? Like, what is the one lesson that you've learned as a teacher that you think is priceless?
Well, okay, so it's more a question of, teaching itself is constantly teaching me, because every student is going to bring, if they're an engaged student, and I've always prioritized just making my courses engaging so people feel involved and they feel they have a place in the course, because that's when there's a kind of a synergy, a kind of an energy that happens. And essentially, any student who just gets involved in a course will end up teaching me things, because they're going to be listening to different kinds of music than me. And if I invite them to choose, a musical example to analyze, they're going to play it for me and they're going to tell me about it. And I'm going to learn about that, because it's not something that I'll normally be putting on my playlists. And so that's really happening all the time. So it's not any one lesson, I would say. It's more that teaching teaches you. And that's the number one fringe benefit of the job, is that you're always learning along with your students. It goes back and forth, at least optimally, when you've got students who are open to really kind of synergizing and investing in the class so that things happen both ways.
So you obviously had Trebas and music technique that were places that you visited and were a part of. And what was your experience as a teacher over there, and when you started out there? What did you experience?
Right. It was the beginning of my teaching career. So the two situations were somewhat different. Trebas was this pioneering effort, and the curriculum had been designed by the owner of the school, who was, taking considerable financial risk trying to start a school like this in Canada, because it had never been done before. And so I just basically walked in, and whatever curriculum had been laid out, I fit into a whole bunch of slots. I mean, I taught songwriting there, I taught synthesis there, I taught music theory, and a bunch of other related topics. So that went on for a number of years, but a small contingent of us that included the sort of school director at one point decided to establish her own school, wanted to, go out on a different kind of thing. And that became Musitechnic. And so for a period of a year, myself and two other teachers worked with her to develop eventually a Quebec ministry-approved program that was called Computer-Assisted Sound Design. And that ended up being given not only privately at Musitechnic, where we designed it and gave it, but in a number of CEGEPs. They just sort of took the design, the curricular design of that particular program and used it. So I had much more of a stake at Musitechnic, and I even designed courses that weren't in the initial sort of cluster that they submitted to the ministry that kind of ended up entering the stream as well. So it was very good in the sense that I really had total pedagogical control over my courses, and I was able to give them in the way that I thought worked best. And it really gave me great training in how to deliver learning material in a way that really worked for students. So that was many years' experience there before I made the jump to teaching at the university level.
Okay.
Wow. So for somebody who has taught for many, many years, what has it been like for you to see your students grow as professionals in music and audio?
Well, it makes it all worthwhile, essentially. It just creates this ongoing motivation to keep teaching, because when you're giving things to people knowledge-wise that they end up using and they end up excelling in some kind of field, it's a great feeling. You're sort of, and when some of them come back to you and say, what I learned in your courses, it's really kind of the basis of so much what I'm doing now, then it really is kind of a very confirming type of thing. So I'm always aiming precisely to have that happen, for people to take the stuff I teach them and use it, and, consciously, unconsciously, on whatever level, doesn't matter to me, as long as it's of benefit to them. So it's a hugely nourishing kind of thing.
And are there any students throughout your teaching career that really stood out to you?
Well,
obviously you don't have to say any names, just
but some of the names. Certainly, let's just say one of the full-time professors in electroacoustics at Concordia, who's the head of the area now and is about to become the chair of the department, was my student once upon a time, Eldad Sabri.
Yeah, exactly.
And he, of course, stood out right away, a mature student who comes in and just composes so beautifully. It was a particular composition-oriented course that I taught him at Musitechnic, and I was just so impressed by him that, when some opportunities came up at Concordia, I let people there know about him, and it all went from there. And now he's, a tenured professor in the music department there, one of my colleagues. So him, of course. And there were a number of people who have come through my second year composition class at Concordia that have really kind of impressed me. One group of them came up to me. I teach that course, as you both know, for the full year, but I'm kind of the main composition teacher in the fall. And then I just continue as a lecturer in the winter while another professor takes over the composition workshops, if you will.
Yeah.
But there were a few young composers in one of my classes who came up to me at the beginning of the winter term and they said, you know, our final pieces that we handed into you for the composition tutorials in the course. I said, yeah, what about them? And they said, well, we submitted them to some pretty big electroacoustic festivals and we got accepted. So they took their homework for me and they submitted it to
that's great,
you know, the New York Electroacoustic Music Festival, and they got in.
That's
so
incredible.
I said, okay, something I'm doing is working here. So those students really impressed me for having taken that kind of initiative and really obviously having taken in all of my compositional training that I gave them in a type of way that really, really worked for them. So that's something that stood out. And just last year, 2 students of mine in that class won the JTTP prize at Concordia, the first time that students in our department have ever won it. And they had just studied with me. So that made me feel pretty good as well. So those are some highlights.
For sure. I bet.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It's so rewarding to hear that. I think you hit on a very important point when you were mentioning Eldad. Just, you know, from the get-go, you knew there was something special about him as a student, and now he's gone on to do fantastic things. When you look at a student starting out or maybe halfway through the program, what elements does a student must have for you to be like, you know that great things are going to accomplish? Is it just hard work? Is it motivation? Is it a combination of everything? What do you need to see in a student for you to tell yourself that you know that there's something fantastic and special about that individual?
Well, I don't know if it's so much an individual thing, but I consider the 2 main ingredients for anybody being a success in the arts, like to have power behind their work, is to have the passion for it. Everybody knows that, but at the same time, to have the ability to analyze. And that seems kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people because it seems like, well, if you're analyzing, you're kind of in your brain and you're picking things apart. And what does that got to do with creativity? But to me, the engine that powers everybody's creativity is the combination of the 2. I actually coined a little term around it. I call it the P.A.D., the passion analysis dialectic. Dialectic being when 2 seemingly opposite things kind of come together to form a greater whole. And that to me is what everybody needs. And when I see students who have it, they've got the passion, they've got the drive, they've got the love of it, but they're also really got clear analytical minds. I say to myself, that person can do something for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. So what is the biggest lesson that you've learned over the decades that you've taught music and sound? You mentioned earlier that, you know, their teaching is a constant lesson that you learn a lot, but I'm sure there must have been big moments for you where you learned fantastic things from all the people that you've taught over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought about this because I did have your questions in advance, and I'd say the kind of number one thing that I've taken out of it is that everyone's connected in sound.
Yes.
That you can have some people who are maybe more on the compositional side, some people more on the recording side. You can have musical performers, all the people that are studying sound. To me, everyone's bound together in a way because they have this kind of common love and there's just a commonality between them. And as soon as you start conceiving it that way, you see that really the main idea is just to make people work together, synergize, just get used to the idea of we're all in this together. Let's just work to make something fantastic happen with music and sound. And so people who are open to that, who really like working with other people, like getting excited about projects with other people, to me, those are the people who have the best chance of going far in their development as artists, craftspeople, however they conceive of themselves. So that's maybe the biggest thing I take away and try to build into my courses and how I work with people in a learning situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I was really curious. So as someone who has taught for many years, how has the pandemic affected your teachings and your classroom? What are some of the main differences you've noticed?
It's actually mostly positive in the sense of I find the ability to give a class in multiple formats. I mean, you can all be together as a class and you can go through some lecture material, but then you can set up multiple Zoom sessions where smaller groups of people get together, and you can kind of flexibly, usually during the pandemic, schedule them at different times because people were more available than usual. And also, there's always that ability to have real one-on-one time. You don't have to set office hours. You just get together on Zoom and talk over what people have to know. So pedagogically, I've found it's kind of a bit more flexible in a positive way, and I've really enjoyed it, and I've designed my courses quite easily to be given effectively in that format. I really feel for the students not having the kind of social aspect of being a university student. That's the most difficult part of all. But
I agree.
Really, besides the different modes, the students themselves behave differently. Like, I'll give you an example. In my largest lectures, some of them go up to 200 students, and I would give those in like a big auditorium at Concordia that would, one of the few rooms on campus that could accommodate a big group like that. And people would be so intimidated to ever ask a question. It's like they had stage fright or something about putting up their hand and asking for a clarification. Fact is, in the pandemic, you've had the chat in all of your Zoom classes, and there's sometimes floods of questions coming into the chat because people aren't shy. And that's allowed me as a teacher to clarify all these points. People have been asking things that they're not scared to ask what they don't understand, so I explain it again. And it's just like worked out that I think people actually have gotten, if they're able to get past the psychological stuff, the mental health issues and all those kind of things. To me, in my classes, they've had an even more positive experience than in person. So not that I mind going back, I want it for the students and all the rest of it, but it's been a very positive thing for me.
That makes a lot of sense that there would be more interaction question-wise with the students because, like you said, students aren't really worried to ask questions when it's a direct message rather than in front of a classroom of 200 people. But, wouldn't it be a little bit uncomfortable? Because it says it's such a technical program. Wouldn't not having access to a studio affect that?
Well, that was definitely rough. I mean, right off the bat, we were all scrambling and trying to find ways that could compensate for the facilities being closed off. I mean, that didn't last forever. It was mostly like the first wave of the pandemic, the shutdown in March of 2020, where just everything was shut up tight. And the following fall wasn't great either. But then things started progressively opening up. And one thing I did is I just went out and bought some used gear that actually allowed me to have a 5.1 system at home. I said, that's the very least I can do for the students is give them the option. If they're going to be able to get into school and work in the studios and do a 5-channel piece, then I've got to be able to listen to it. And so I have that set up now, and people have the option of doing 5.1 multi-channel pieces and all the rest of it. And so it's been sort of compensated for in different ways. And at first I also had the idea of, well, what if we help each other out? And if different people in the class have different monitors, why don't we send some mixes around so people can listen to them and give feedback on how they sound on this system or that system? And it was a good idea. It never really took off, but we were all trying to do what we could to compensate for the lack of facilities. And then over time, they just basically started opening up the facilities, and it wasn't as much of an issue anymore.
I see.
Thank you.
So moving a bit away from everything that's teaching related, I really want to get into the music and discography. And the first question that I have here in the document for you, obviously you've done many records, some with Bug Alley. We have Karen Young, we have Du Côté de chez Proust. And I just want to know, obviously I'd love to talk about all 20 plus of them, but what are some of your favorite records that you were a part of? Like, what would you like to highlight and share?
The two I'd say that, I put on my list when I saw the question was the Virtual Memoir album, just because it was such a unique project. So I conceived this idea of writing a full-length novel with characters, the usual things that you find in a novel, a story being told, different situations unfolding, and that I would create an album that sort of interfaced with that novel in different ways. And so the lyrics of the tunes would sort of touch on the themes that were going through the book, but not in any specific way. It was just like a parallel work. So this kind of concept album was on the one part of the project, and the print book was on the other. And so that was so interesting for me because I just allowed myself to go into all of these musical areas, from Gregorian chant to different types of semi-classical music. I had a string quartet there and at one point, and it was just creatively really dynamic kind of project for me. And of course, I was producing and playing and musically directing and all these things. So I'll always remember that album for sure. And I guess the second one that really hits that list is an album I did for my Latvian band's kind of, I guess it was a bit of a farewell because we knew that that band wasn't going to be able to last much longer. But the country of Latvia celebrated its 100th anniversary of independence in 2018. And we all knew that lots of special things were going to be happening that year. And I married a woman of Latvian background. And so I've made many friends in that community, and a number of them are musical friends. And we had this really nice musical ensemble that we decided, let's make a record for the centenary. And so we got all the ideas together. And again, I was acting, exclusively as producer for the whole thing. And knowing that these weren't, professional musicians necessarily, I knew that it was going to be a real post-production kind of job, that people would come in and they would do their best, but there was going to have to be lots of little fixes to things. So it was just a very heavy post-production project, but that just turned out so great. And I knew, people are going to be listening to this album for many, many years. Latvians are like that. They're singing songs that were composed 1,000 years ago. So things last in that culture, if you know what I mean. And I knew that this album stood the potential of really, being one of those iconic kind of diasporic music productions. And I really put a lot into it, and the results were really gratifying. So those are the two I'd say at the top of my list.
Definitely.
Nice. And can you maybe give us some of your thoughts on being a performer versus being a producer? What are the main differences?
Right. It's the two sides of the glass. And so when you're in the studio and performing, the pressure is around, well, I got to get it right. And there's all these people listening to me, and everything is kind of discombobulated. You might be overdubbing, or you might be doing something, on headphones with a few live musicians, but they're all behind baffles and you can't really hear them, except through your phones. So there's always a certain amount of adaptation in the studio when you're performing something. The thing about being a producer, it's like being a band leader. You've got to be thinking of the whole context, the whole picture all the time. So there's
you're making the executive decisions.
Calculations. It's like this whole other part of your brain is working all the time. Whereas, say, when I sing in a choir, like I mentioned, singing in the symphony choir, I think at one point a little bit earlier, I sing in a really good chamber choir. Someone else is in the driver's seat. It's the conductor's thing. The conductor is the one, sort of just concerned about a certain interpretation and that everybody learns right and that is singing well and for all that. And I can just kind of do my part. And sometimes that can end up, especially when you get to the performances themselves, to be absolutely sublime. I mean, I mentioned one of my musical peak experiences in the prison back in Concordia days, but another one I remember is singing in the Montreal Symphony Choir, singing the Brahms Requiem, just this sublimely beautiful piece of classical music. And there was just this one performance, this one night, because you'll do like 3 nights in a row, right? And you'll do a Friday night, you'll do a Saturday, and you'll do a Sunday matinee kind of thing of all the same repertoire. But there was just this one of a set of 3 performance where everybody felt it. It was sort of like the current was running from the audience through you, through all the musicians around you, through the instrumentalists playing on the floor. It was like this current of energy going through everyone. And it's just your mind was clear, and there was just this beautiful sound that was coming out from everywhere. And so you can have those kind of experiences where you're not the one up at the podium, just making sure that everybody's together and that this tempo is right and all the rest of it. You don't have any of that stuff to think. You can just lend yourself to it and get lost in the experience of the performance. And that can be beautiful. And of course, being a producer has its own rewards too.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned just now, performing vocally in a choir. Outside of vocals, what other instruments do you play? I've seen it myself at Laptop Orchestra, what you play, but for the audience, what other instruments have you done?
Right. I started playing a bit of piano when I was young, as I told you, didn't really continue with that. But the instrument I took up in my teens was the flute. And then that was followed by the alto sax. The next year when I went to Vanier and I took that elective, they had instruments that they loaned out to people. If they wanted to be in the orchestra, you would get a sax out of it. So that's how I started playing. So from 15 and 16, they're pretty deeply wired in my being. I can play those instruments now and not be struggling with anything and just concentrate on the ideas that will come out, say, in a jazz solo or whatever it might be. And so I'm grateful to have had all those years behind me where I was able to master an instrument to a certain degree and then just kind of bring that expression to whoever I can in in different projects that I'm in.
Which one of those instruments would you say is you're most comfortable with if you had to choose?
Depends. Alto sax just takes a little bit more wind, a little bit more physical energy to play. So if you're not at your most energetic, sometimes it's nice just to pick up the flute because it's a smaller instrument.
Okay.
But really, it's like asking, who do you love more, your son or your daughter? It's like,
they're all so
For sure.
amazing.
There's no answer. There's no answer.
That's
to
fair.
that question,
Absolutely.
really.
That's fair. So we see a lot of jazz in your discography when we were looking you up. Can you tell us a little bit about your history in jazz music?
So I started an ensemble called Poetry of Jazz that basically the concept is my original lyrics for existing jazz repertoire. So you'll have pieces that people will have heard many, many times, and they either never had words or the words are so old-fashioned that you almost cringe listening to them. So I said, we got to fix this situation somehow. This is beautiful music, but the words are just horrible. And so we have this entire repertoire of jazz compositions that have my lyrics to them. So it's a quintet. Of course, the lead vocalist, Sienna Dolan, she actually teaches at Concordia. She's one of the vocal instructors there. And she's just a beautiful, beautiful singer who helps interpret these vocally. I'm there on sax and flute. And then I have guitar, bass, and drums, including another colleague of mine from Concordia, Gary Schwartz. And so in addition to that concept of the original lyrics, the format that we play the music in is uniquely interactive. Like there are certain ensembles in jazz history that have been especially interactive. They've gone on stage and how they interpret a tune is radically different from time to time because they're all just listening to each other. It's not exactly free jazz, but something approaching it. Like the Bill Evans trio of the early 1960s was that kind of thing. They just kind of reinvented that format of piano, bass, and drums to just always be interacting with one another. And every instrument was an accompanist for the other instruments and a soloist at some times. And it would go back and forth, back and forth. So we multiply that by 5. We just sort of open up. And like the great Miles Davis second quintet that also did that kind of thing, it's just every rendition that you hear of a particular, known jazz tune is going to be very different because we set up open structures and we're able to do lots of different things within those structures. So that's, my latest initiative. It started right before the pandemic and we've managed to play a total of 3 times in our existence since 2019.
Okay.
And 2 of them were under pandemic conditions with, vaccine mandated entry requirements and masking and just the whole 9 yards. And everybody's concern in those situations is actually the sax and the flute and the voice because you can't put on a mask when you're playing those instruments.
No, of course.
And you do kind of put out a lot of droplets and aerosols and so on because you're pumping out a lot of wind.
Yeah.
So solution has been to kind of rearrange the usual positioning of the band so that we're next to the drummer at the sort of back of whatever bandstand, and the guitarist and the bassist who, don't vocally make any noises are in the front closer so that we're the maximum distance possible from the audience. And we've managed to do 2, and they've been incredible. People have been so appreciative of hearing live music and just having people there, just doing this thing in this room that has never happened before.
Yeah.
And so I knew it was going to be a powerful thing getting back to live music, but that project, Poetry of Jazz, has been my sort of ticket to do that so far.
That's amazing.
So you asked me about my song, Your Stars Above, and that's not actually a jazz song. It's more in a kind of a pop idiom. And that's a very, very special song to me. I wrote it for a friend of mine who was struggling with cancer, and sadly she passed away just from diagnosis.
I'm so sorry.
Diagnosis to death was like 9 months. And so there was this really intense period where I was seeing her and just, being her friend through this struggle she was having. And it was just that experience some songwriters talk about where the song just came through me. I remember I was just in a bath, just having a bath one day, and this whole song came through that I ended up calling Your Stars Above. And it was just about people who are in difficulty, who find that all of this help, all of this healing just sort of appears seemingly out of nowhere. And you just have this experience of like, wow, there's a lot of really nice energy out there that you don't realize is there until you're in a difficult position and people have to extend themselves to you to help you out. And so it was dedicated to her. I actually sang it for her at her place. You know, she brought her to tears and all the rest of it. So she managed to hear it and she knew that I had written it. And I just ended up creating this project that allowed me to put it on a little album that came out. And I'm still kind of looking for the right setting for that particular song. I've tried it in about 10 different ways so far, and different people have sung it and different combinations of instruments have attempted to interpret it. And in the end, I think my simple little chorale-like synth accompaniment is ultimately what I'll stick with, but I still need the exact right singer for it. So that's that one.
That's absolutely beautiful.
So you asked about some of my other projects like Saxtet and Jazz Cartoon, and these were sort of 1980s, early 90s jazz projects. The Saxtet one was my own. I had the idea of putting together a 6-piece band with 3 saxophonists who also sang as the kind of front, and then a rhythm section behind that. So, you know, we had some nice gigs, put out a little record, did some interesting things. Ultimately didn't really fly long term, you know, in terms of opportunities and all the rest of it. And so that kind of came and went. But the other one, Jazz Cartoon, was sort of an innovative quartet with a vocalist, myself on horns, and just bass and drums, no chord instrument. And so that was a little bit of an exploration. It was the singer's project, so I was a little bit like a sideman, but someone who contributed heavily to repertoire. Like I wrote a lot for that particular project. And so they were both really interesting projects. You know, back in the days when you would play in clubs so smoky that you would come out and you practically couldn't see from the smoke, but there we were sort of making our jazz music in those kind of situations back then. You asked about the Concordia Jazz faculty concerts. Yes. This goes back to a period of the music department that you may not remember, when the whole music department was out at Loyola and the Oscar Peterson Concert Hall was right there, and you could just kind of rehearse over in the music department and then just hop over to the concert hall and do concerts there. And I was teaching exclusively electroacoustics. Those were my sort of early music university level teaching, but people knew I was a jazz musician, and eventually people thought, well, why don't you just join us? I mean, I know we do this so that the students can hear us play in jazz, but doesn't matter if they don't know you right now, just come on and play. So it was always this treat that would happen a couple of times a year, these great jazz musicians who would just kind of put an ensemble together, whoever was available. We'd go on stage, play, do a little concert, and it was just a lot of fun. And so that's been another nice project that, of course, has stopped over the past couple of years, and I'm really hoping can maybe start up again someday.
Sounds fun.
And the last one on your list there that I can talk to, you asked about context creation in jazz. That was an interesting one. I got a grant to just explore. My proposal for the grant was to explore different ways of arriving at original material in a jazz kind of context. Like normally someone just writes a tune, brings it into the band, you know, hands them their lead sheet, and away the band goes, and that's how, you know, original music is composed. But I said, well, what if it was done a different way? What if the music itself was generated through a process of improvisation? So the way it worked was this. I would start off the process by going into the studio, and I had the funding to, you know, just go to a professional studio and do all the recording that way. So I would go in, just solo saxophone, and just improvise. Just go in with only the vaguest idea of what I wanted to do and just create something.
Oh, nice.
And then what would happen is the next person in the kind of chain of creation would come along, listen to what I did, and then go into the studio and record their own solo. And so that would get passed off to a guitarist, for example, who would go in. They would have heard my solo creation, and then they would go in and kind of bounce off it and do their own solo creation. And then we would come together and do a duo based on everything that had happened before. And then it would go to a third musician. So the third musician in this case was a percussionist, would listen to what we'd all done individually, and as a duo would do his own individual piece, and then we would get together as a trio. And it kind of continued all the way up to quartet that way. Some really, really interesting stuff that came out of that whole process. And it was just different. It's just not the way you normally do it. And I'm always exploring. So that was, you know, a cool project that way.
That's amazing. I really love the concept of that.
Quick.
Yeah, so I think that's the end of that list.
Yeah, that's the end of that list from what I can tell. Okay, perfect. And so I want to know, tell us about your experience doing music for theater and how does it compare to music that you've done for other media such as film?
Right. Well, theater is where I started. Everything I did sound design wise was in a live context. So I would work with a director, but I'd also be part of the theatrical company because I would perform the stuff as well. And so whatever I was developing would be played in rehearsals and the actors would be working with it and it would create a certain type of mood, but it was super interactive that kind of way in the way that post-production work just isn't. So that was great. And I did a lot of work with dancers and even painters. You had some questions further down the line about some of those things. But in terms of theater, it was just where I kind of really started to love composing for, a dramatic work. And the sort of follow through to film sound design was a pretty natural one after having started out in theater.
Definitely. I can see how that gets more natural as you do it more. And we can definitely talk about Bug Alley at this point. This is something I'm really interested to know more about. So obviously, it's a vocal jazz group that you were a part of. Can you tell us more about it? And then eventually lead into what is it like to be Grammy nominated?
I think my answer on the Grammy thing is going to be disappointing to you because, anyways, I'll get to that at the time. But the group itself was just one of those serendipitous type of things that happened. So I had met this guitarist who had come up to Montreal from the States, super talented guitar player named Steve Cole, and we had created this little performing duo. So I would play my instruments, he would play guitar, and we would just kind of go around to the open mic nights in different kind of folk clubs around Montreal at that particular time. And we would do jazzy stuff. We weren't playing folk music, we were playing the kind of music that we liked. And it went down really well because people in those kinds of listening situations like the variety when someone comes in, does something a little different. So we'd been doing that for a while. And this one time we got booked at a folk festival up in the Laurentians in Morin Heights at a place called Rose's Cantina at that time. And they would just have, rotating folk groups or folk related groups or whatever. And my little duo with Steve Cole was among them. And we heard this other trio who came up and sang just this beautiful vocal stuff. It was kind of like country swing, if you know that particular style. And they just had this beautiful vocal blend. And I said, man, these people sound great. And just completely naturally, they came up to us in one of the breaks and said, man, you guys sound good. And likewise, feelings mutual. And we'd really like to get into jazz and you guys seem to know about it. Do you want to get together and play? And so that's how the band formed, as we started getting together and we realized, man, we got something here. And we became this really, really good sort of jazz ensemble. But, then the other part of the story happened where, kind of thing that sometimes happens with success is you feel like your life is kind of out of your control for a little while. And all the stuff that came with being in that band eventually caught up with me in my, sort of mid-20ish when I was still 24. Because my dad had a really serious illness, that lasted the last 10 years of his life. And he died that particular year. So it was a bad combination of sort of not being able to handle the road, being in this emotionally fragile state. And I really felt the need at that particular juncture to find out more about the meaning of life. My spiritual life suddenly became really important to me. And I ended up living in a Zen center full time for 5 years starting then. So it was a really, really radical turning point for me. It's when I started teaching. All that stuff happened at the same time. And so to answer your question about the Grammy nomination, it meant absolutely nothing to me when it happened because I did the record and then I wasn't in it anymore. I wasn't in that world. And I said, oh yeah, interesting. Yeah, got a nomination for the Grammys. Nice. That was it.
I see. Okay.
Didn't mean a single thing to me at that particular time. It's nice to be able to put in your CV now because it was like a really successful record and it just really did make a contribution. And I have, a bunch of my material on there and all the rest of it. But the Grammy nomination can't say that it meant anything to me at the time, unfortunately.
Right.
Well, I mean,
would you say it does now?
It's different for everyone. Yeah, it's different for everyone. Oh yeah, I'm curious. To know that.
Well, I mean, a Grammy nomination, let's face it, it's a little bit indirect, right? You didn't win it.
It's huge.
You didn't win it, but we were in a certain category and it was a respectable record and it got the nomination that year. I suppose it's nice. It definitely underlines the fact that group really had something going for it at the time. And I'll just put in a little side story here if it's okay. I had the strangest email that came into my inbox during the pandemic that eventually became a Zoom conversation and an ongoing thing. And it was this professor from Spain, actually a person of German origin who was teaching in Spain. And he was an expert and actually living in the small city of La Mancha. If you've ever heard of like The Man from La Mancha, it's about Don Quixote, the famous sort of mythological hero of one of the first great Western novels ever written, Don Quixote. And so this guy had just really deep expertise in Don Quixote. And he contacts me saying, I came across this composition of yours by this band called Bug Alley that's called the Sancho Suite. And could you tell me if it had anything to do with the character in the Cervantes book, sort of Don Quixote's sidekick and companion, Sancho Panza? And I just like to know more about it because I'm writing this book about it, about, that book and its resonance in the world of music. So I said, cool. So I got in touch with him and I said, honestly, I had read the book, but the real reason it was called the Sancho Suite is there was this little bistro, and it's where I had my first dates with my girlfriend-to-be of the next 3 years, and we would sit in this little bistro having these intimate conversations. And so that was what was kind of on my mind when I wrote that tune called the Sancho Suite. But this guy was so resourceful. I said, I think that place, it was called La Bodega, and it had this little bistro inside it. And I said, I think it was on Park Avenue. Next thing I know, the guy is sending me a picture of a matchbook from that particular Sancho Panza bistro. He'd actually found this thing. So we got in this great conversation. And, that kind of thing means a lot more to me now than the Grammy nomination when it comes to Bug Alley. Just the thought that someone's there still listening to this music and music that I wrote and interested enough to ask me about it and get into this conversation about it. So, yeah.
Definitely. Wow. So you said Park Avenue? That was in Montreal or Park Avenue, New York?
No. Oh, okay. Park Avenue here, down in the student ghetto. Okay. I looked there. It's just
Nice.
just condos now, but it's just a little bit below where La Cité is now. They used to have this little place, and as soon as you were of age, you could go in there and have a cheap beer or whatever, cheap meal.
Okay.
Anyways, that's the little story about Bug Alley that I wanted to.
That's amazing.
include.
That's a great story.
It's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen in your portfolio that you section your projects by genre rather than chronologically. So among some of your listed works are Virtual Memoir, a multimedia project. In theater, there's Macbeth. In dance, there's Fragments of Knowing. And in painting or still art, there's Signe. Can you maybe elaborate on working across interdisciplinary genres?
Absolutely. Well, I told you about the Virtual Memoir project before, so you're going to have that. Mm-hmm. Macbeth, it was just one of those productions that I did in my theater sound design days. And just to give you an idea, I had a lot of freedom. In all the projects I would go into, they would give me a lot of latitude. And so I would be, bringing in patch chord synths and working with them, with the actors in rehearsal and just coming up with these different sounds. So it was this really, as I said, avant-garde interpretation of Macbeth. And
Right.
I just sort of mixed in the synth stuff with my sax and flute, and I'd play through a mic and I'd process them through all these old Echoplex type things. And they were
Really
happy with all that kind of wacky stuff that I was doing. So I said, great, give me more of this. And so that was Macbeth, just among other productions that I did at the time. Fragments of Knowing happened quite a bit later in the 90s, and it was quite interesting in the sense that it was truly multidisciplinary. Vicky Tansey was the creator of the work. She's a dancer as well as a painter, and so it was kind of like a painting exhibition, but that came with this sort of multimedia theatrical piece that I composed the sound for. But she also included me in the company, like I kind of performed at the launch and all the rest of it. And we did a version of my piece in an electroacoustic concert out at the Oscar Peterson Hall that I'll always remember.
Okay.
Because we brought in all the kind of actors and musicians who played in the production itself in to do that particular performance. And the two of you, I'm sure, have been to electroacoustic concerts before. Everybody is really focused and listening, and they're just really focused through their ears on what's coming out of the loudspeakers and all the rest of it. But this version of the piece, it was on the program as a mixed piece, that there was going to be some live components as well as what was playing on the multi-channel speakers in there. And I decided, okay, let's do it this way. All of us in the ensemble, we're going to take seats with the audience. And we're going to have our instruments with us. Eldad was actually in that one. He plays the flute. And so he and I were sort of going back and forth playing flutes. But nobody knew we were there to play live. So we're all sitting in our seats. And there was this one cue that came in the pre-recorded music where we all leapt out of our seats into the aisle and yelled at the same time. And everybody in the place just about crap their pants. They were so shocked because this has never happened in a concert like that before, where suddenly the live performers leap out of the audience from your midst, and then they're there with their instruments, and we were playing and going back and forth, and there was this cello and two flutes and all these, kind of instruments going back and forth. So that was a very cool kind of project that had its day and was a lot of fun. And the Pinsinneault goes back again into the 80s. That would be. And it was this painter who I indirectly knew at the time. And just, I don't know, I think it was at a party maybe once when I met her. And we just cooked up this project of, what if I came by your painting studio and improvised while you were painting? And your painting would somehow react in whatever way. It would be like a kind of an improvisation in itself, where whatever I was doing musically would somehow translate visually into what you put on the canvas. So we did a bunch of those sessions together. She ended up with a bunch of paintings, and she ended up creating an exhibit for which I recorded a certain amount of the music to sort of play at the same time. And we had all these plans for a follow-up project where something that's common that you find in art galleries now, but it would be the kind of thing where there would be little triggers set up in the place where if someone walked across a beam, it would sort of trigger playback of one layer of a composition. And depending how many people were in the room and how often the signal was tripped, it would determine, how often or how many layers were playing at a particular time. And so the whole nature of the composition would change according to the movements that were happening in the gallery. So she goes to her advisor. She was doing an MFA at UQAM at that time and says, what about this idea that we do this? And, advisor looks at her with this kind of arms crossed across his chest, sort of saying, nah, that kind of thing has been done before. Think of something else. And I said to myself, that's like saying to a composition student, what do you mean a string quartet? It's been done before. Why do you want to write a string quartet? It was stupid.
Yeah.
It was just stupid. But
Wow.
anyways, the follow-up project never happened. So that's a little bit of my interdisciplinary highlight world for you there.
Okay.
Right. All right, perfect. Okay, so I'm really excited about this next question. When we were researching you, we came across the Trajectories, which is an electroacoustic composers collective. And I really wanted to know what your involvement in Trajectories is. And along the line, why should an up-and-coming electroacoustic composer interest themselves in Trajectories?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting group. So what happened as soon as the pandemic hit and that particular school year where I know you were both at university still at that time, when that ended, my second year composition students, a few of them just got in touch with me saying, we were wondering if there was any way we could continue working with you. We want to keep developing our compositional skills. We don't want to go stale in this pandemic and all the rest of it. And what would you think about just getting together on Zoom once in a while, talking about things? Maybe we can play each other drafts of things that we're working on, trying to extend a little bit what happened in this composition class. And some of these were the same people who had submitted their work for me to the festivals and got accepted. So they knew that what they learned from me was something that they really wanted to hold on to and continue to develop. So I said, great, that sounds fantastic. Let's just get together. And so in the course of our kind of Zoom conversations, it emerged why don't we actually focus on this pandemic? Because we're living in these historic times. This kind of thing does not happen very often. And the more you read about art, you realize that it's the artists that are alive in historical times that make all the difference. Because if they bounce off it, they do something that is so immediate for people that it's got this kind of power.
Right.
It's sort of amplified by the times that they live in. So we decided to do that. And basically, we just continued doing little experiments. We tried all kinds of things like serial etudes where someone would start it, hand it off to the next person. And then we tried layered etudes where someone would compose a bunch of stuff, and that would be stems, that would be layers on top of what the next person would do. And then you would end up with this really deep texture. It sort of went on. And eventually we said, hey, this stuff is good. Let's do an album. And so essentially that's where we're at. We've mixed a total of 3 tracks on a 10-track album, just with little bits of funding that have come through. Tragically, we started working with this really seminal, another ex-student of mine, Rob Heaney, one of the most amazing sound engineers in Canada for sure. And he tragically passed away a short while ago at a reasonably unexpected age, like just past 60, just had a hidden heart condition and just wasn't there. But after him, we found someone in the States who I had met through my sound design work, and we're just moving ahead with this. And it's as alive and kicking as ever. We've got a website. It's a super interesting project. And I think this work that's going to be fully released, hopefully in the spring, is going to have something to say to these times, something very, very direct and powerful. And we've also been creating these video etudes that we post on Instagram, on the group's Instagram page. And that's past 40 etudes now and could eventually be part of an art exhibit, sort of presented in a gallery space along with the album itself at some point. So it's a happening project and really very, very dynamic and exciting. And I think anybody in the field of sound would hear some really, really interesting things in these compositions, some of which have already been released, but most of which are coming down the line in a few months.
Right. Fantastic.
Okay.
That's so cool.
Nice.
That is so cool.
Very cool. I would like to perhaps focus on the sound design aspect of your career now. Like, to start off, how were you first introduced to the art of sound design?
Well, that was the theater work that I was talking about earlier. That was where I first saw the possibilities. I say, cool, you've got this dramatic work, you've got this director that's bringing it all together, but you can work with that director and provide sound and music that's going to underscore, support, buoy the storytelling. And so that's where I started getting the bug for plugging my compositional skill into that kind of world of interfacing with another work.
Okay, very cool. And moving away from your introduction to it, not only did you do sound design, but you did sound recording. I'm thinking about Andy in the City, where you were doing sound recording supervision and sound designing. I was wondering if you could compare and contrast those two roles, a sound designer and a recordist. What is the biggest difference between those two?
Well, okay, so sound design is sort of pretty obviously focused on pure creativity. You've got to come up with ideas. You've got to create sound that's going to fit the project. The recordist has a lot more technical considerations. I've got to get clean sound here. I've got to capture these actors' voices in a way that can be usable because the performances on the set are always usually better than what you're going to get in a studio dubbing afterwards. But that said, I've known so many great sound engineers in my time that I realize sound recording is tremendously creative for people who are focused on it. I've just never had that particular skill set. And so when I did sound recordist work, it was primarily for projects that were small enough that they couldn't find anyone who knew what they were doing. So I said, okay, I'll volunteer. I'll come in and I'll make sure the levels are okay so that you have sound that you can use after the fact. But sound recordists just have a different set of considerations. If they're, for example, recording ambient sound, they're going to have a feel for what's needed, and they're going to have to collaborate with the director, say, as to this is the type of sound we anticipate needing in post-production, and can you make sure that you get this type of thing and that kind of thing? And so there'll be often like a sort of a job list to do. And so it's just kind of apples and oranges in some kind of way, but all part of the same project.
Okay.
Right. Absolutely.
So when you do sound design, how has the development of technology, for example, plugins, DAWs, VSTs, and so forth, changed your workflow from when you first started doing sound design to now? The equipment you used in school while you were learning versus now?
Right. So the one thing about all the old analog gear and the patch cord synths and tape machines and all those kind of things, it sort of creates this narrower set of possibilities for you. You have to work with limited resources when you're working with that kind of gear. There's one book that really made a deep impression on me. It's this huge volume called Recording the Beatles. And it's this absolutely meticulous accounting of all the Beatles recording sessions at Abbey Road and even a few that they did outside of Abbey Road. And it just shows their kind of workflow. And it was, of necessity, slower. You would have to lay down certain tracks tracks, and then you would have to plan to kind of bounce those tracks together so that you could liberate another track to add some other things when they were working in 4-track and all the rest of it. So certainly my recollection of working in that world is that you had to work a bit slower, and it gave you sort of time to feel out what you were doing. And it also narrowed the possibilities for you. Whereas when you get to the digital domain of composing, the possibilities certainly now are endless. You can have endless number of tracks, endless sound sources, and it's almost like your challenge becomes, how do I narrow this down? How do I sort of limit my options so that I'm not constantly in a state of indecision and diluting my ideas because there's just too many possibilities that I'm considering? So it's two different sets of challenges, but certainly when I look back in time, it imposed the limitations on you. And when you think of all the great music that was created in those years when there was such limited technological possibility, it's clear that it's a working method that comes recommended by some great results.
Yeah, right. No, definitely. I feel like this next question, you almost answered it, but if you can think of anything specific, then I definitely would love to know. But is there anything that you used to do back then that has been replaced by technology with the evolution of we're not as analog anymore? I'd love to know that.
Sure. Well, for me, the answer is things haven't changed much because I've always been a melodic instrument player. The fact that I didn't continue those piano lessons at 6 meant that I couldn't just sit down and have chords playing in my left hand and a melody playing in my right hand and just be able to hear what some kind of complex musical creation was going to sound like. So as a melodic instrument player, I always had to use technology. I always need to either have a band where I would literally bring in music sheets and then I would hear what it would sound like right away because people in the band would play it, or I needed technology. And so I had, some of the earlier little multi-track setups and all the rest of it. And I worked in that economical world of having a total of 4 tracks and needed to bounce so many times that when I listen back now to the end products, they're so full of hiss, it's kind of insane. But the fact is, I've always worked that way. And so there was nothing I did in the beginning that technology has suddenly made obsolescent, because it's always been the same process for me. You hear something, you want to say something, and you've got to hear whether it's good or not, or whether you need to revise something or not. And essentially, I've always just used whatever technology is available to do that. So whether it's digital or analog doesn't affect me very much.
Would you say one is better than the other?
No, I'm not going to really opine on that, because the fact is that people sort of are enamored with the warmth of the analog sound, like vinyl records, even tape. It kind of amazes me that people are releasing cassettes again. I said, why are you releasing cassettes? But there's just some kind of romance about these older recording media. And I can't say that it ever has the slightest effect on me, because I'm listening to the music. I don't care about the quality. It has to be such atrocious quality that I can't even hear what they're singing before I'm going to complain about anything, because I just want to hear if it's an amazing song or a beautiful piece, and is it going to enter my heart and do something to me. So what technology that comes to me through, I don't care. I don't really care very much.
Right. That's true. Very fair. A bunch of people, myself included, have purchased vinyl record players a couple of years ago. And I guess, it doesn't necessarily make a difference, but it is nice. It does add a nice texture, I find.
Oh, I'm not saying it doesn't make a difference. There's definitely something different about the sound.
Right.
Oh, 100%.
And if that's your focus as a listener, then it's a huge difference. I'm not putting it down in any way. You just asked if it meant anything to me, and it doesn't.
I know.
But I can totally see people, just loving putting on their vinyl records. Because I do remember the days when everything was vinyl, and you got your whole big record sleeve. And sometimes inside there would be an insert, and you had all this space for artwork, and you really had like an art object in your hands, and you'd be able to study this thing, and there'd be so many liner notes that they could fit in there, and you'd be listening to the record, and you'd be taking in all the information that came with the record. And it was a special kind of experience, that package, especially the vinyl package. And then, everything just started changing, and I just wasn't concerned very much about technology as a listener anymore past that point.
Right.
No, very true. I feel personally that I was very lucky to be taught analog gear when I was doing a college degree, and at the studio that I interned at and worked at for a little while, we had access to beautiful analog gear, and I really started to notice the difference, the beefiness, what an LA to a sounds like in the real life versus a plug-in emulation of it. And it's crazy how we're getting close to the emulation, but there's something about analog that's just different than anything digital.
And in production, absolutely. I mean, the most beautiful microphones, there's a big difference between them, and ultimately they're analog devices. And same thing with processing. When you process through kind of an analog set of rack mounts and so on, the sound you get is very different. I've been to some studios that specialize in analog gear, just like racks and racks of them. Right. And it's pretty cool, but you've got to be deep into the production to really appreciate what it adds.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I was looking at some of your freelance work in sound design. What has your experience been like doing freelance sound design work for independent documentary filmmakers and an iconic brand like Condé Nast?
Right. Well, the Condé Nast project was pretty cool. I have to say that was a pandemic project. It happened very early in the shutdown days.
Okay.
Where this film studio that I'm basically the sound department for, Thoroughbred Pictures, basically was approached by an agency in LA that the director works with sometimes and said, there's this kind of tender that's been put out for this big project, and Condé Nast is putting it out, but their client is Lego. And basically what they wanted were these elaborate soundscapes that sort of coincided with certain Lego sets that they sold. So the deck that they presented had a bunch of different ideas, but the four that ended up getting through was the Taj Mahal, trying to bring people back to the time when the Taj Mahal was being built in Agra in India. Another was the Empire State Building when it was being built in the 1930s in New York. The third one, completely different theme, was about the Millennium Falcon, the sort of Star Wars spacecraft. And the fourth one was called Dream Garage, and it was about this fictional garage where every vehicle that comes in there is just some kind of classic vintage vehicle that all these mechanics are working on. So essentially they said, well, would you like to bid on this? Would you like to just put a bid on this particular contract through us? We'll do it for you. So we put together a little package and we kind of presented ourselves as the kind of up and coming sound studio because the director's young and his girlfriend, the main animator for that company, is also quite young. And so they could present themselves as kind of the upstarts and that we would bring in this quality, whatever. And so we ended up in the running against like Academy Award winning sound designers were putting in because they had a really big budget for this thing. And anything that comes through Condé Nast is going to be pretty decent bucks. And so didn't we win it over the Oscar-winning guy? And so I had this huge budget. I could hire a former student from the program who had graduated as my assistant. I had enough money to pay him to do some research for me. And basically, it was a fascinating experience. I mean, for the Taj Mahal, we were working with sound recordists in India who had recordings from Agra. And so all the birds and all the wildlife would be authentic to at least what Agra is now. If you could get something, without vehicles that wouldn't have existed back at the construction of the Taj Mahal. It was a really fascinating, series of people we could work with because you could pay them all. And so you could have people doing, and I consulted a friend who's a retired Otis elevator executive to say, how did the guys get up and down the Empire State Building when it was being built? And he sort of explained, well, they would have had to do it this way. They would have had to have a central column. They didn't have the things where the elevator runs on the outside of the buildings in those days. They would have had to build the shaft that was eventually going to have the main elevator, and the guys would have to get up on this rickety little elevator to the floor where they were working. And once they had stairs, a lot of them would just be taking the stairs to whatever floor they were working on as well. So just all these things that I found out about, and these cool things like when we were doing the Millennium Falcon, we got the original Ben Burtt sounds for Star Wars, for Chewbacca, and for a whole bunch of different things.
So cool.
And I was just working with this like raw audio from what Chewbacca's different speech was like before they actually edited it. And that all of his speech is from a bear they essentially found a bear in like a large zoo that lived in this big sort of natural enclosure. And he just got the permission to go in there one day, set up a bunch of mics and record this bear grunting and doing all these different things. And so that became Chewbacca. But when I was kind of creating our audio Chewbacca for our little kind of trip that we took in the Millennium Falcon, audio-wise in the soundscape, I would hear like literally the birds chirping in the background and all the different ambient sound that were part of the original recording. Like, this is cool.
That is very cool.
I enjoy this, and so that was really, really nice project. And, very nice on the pocketbook too, to have that coming in during the pandemic. I almost felt bad, all the people losing their jobs, and suddenly these choice jobs are coming my way. But whatever, it happened. And I mean, when it comes to doing documentary films, usually I'm more kind of like a music supervisor, like the filmmaker will have certain tracks in mind. What you think, would this go well here? And we'll kind of, sort through and just make sure they have the right kind of music, or else it's a corporate context where you've got a very specific mission. Like you're sort of doing a presentational video about a pharmaceutical company and you got to have these shots and it's got to have this kind of music, sort of gluing all the shots together.
Right.
So each one has a different flavor, but it's all, different kinds of experience that when it comes your way, you do your best and you learn a lot along the way.
Wow. That is so fantastic. That is, honestly, I feel so inspired hearing that. I think that I look at that project and it motivates me. I want to do something as cool as that. It is just so great to hear. I really want to get into more sound design work of yours, specifically the two short films. The first one being The Chaperone 3D, and then You Ever Hear About the Toad. So whichever one you want to get into first, but those two are very interesting to me.
Right. Well, I'll talk about The Chaperone 3D for sure, because that's kind of the origin point of my main sound design gig. So it goes back to 2013, and I was actually over in Latvia singing in one of those mass choir concerts, where they have 20,000 singers on the stage all singing at the same time. Absolutely unbelievable experience, and I was all kind of high from that. I just came back and I got this call from an old friend of mine who just says, "How you doing? I haven't talked to you in a while. Just wanted to let you know that my son has just gotten this amazing opportunity. He's working on this animated film, and he submitted like a kind of a demo of it to the Toronto International Film Festival, which is a big deal. It's one of the biggest film festivals in the world. And they had like pre-approved. It was one of the only times, I know a friend who works for there says, I've never heard of that before. They pre-approved his film, gave him the time to finish it so that he could be working like literally practically the day before the screening in Toronto, finishing off the last touches. And so I came back and they were really in a situation. I mean, they had transformed their whole family home into this animation studio, people everywhere drawing and doing this and that. And they needed someone who knew what they were doing with sound. And so I came in, I worked with, the main director who, has become basically a partner of mine, Fraser Munden, and he went on to found his company, Thoroughbred Pictures, through this production. So it was this true life story about a dance in the East End of Montreal where a bunch of young kids were attending and this biker gang kind of came crashing in. And it was just about this chaperone that managed to overpower all of them and kind of save the kids. It really happened. So it was a cool film. I did all the sound, and I really developed my working relationship with Fraser Munden, the director, because he's someone with a really strong vision for sound. It just needed someone that was able to realize the ideas that he already had. And I was perfectly happy to do that, not wanting to impose my own will when he already had really good ideas for the sound that he wanted. So he'd already lined up a band like that played 70s repertoire because the action takes place in the early 70s. And so I basically took that band into the studio and I acted as the producer for that session, and we recorded all the musical tracks that were needed. And then from that, I went and created all of the sound design that he needed and basically even handled the voiceovers and just put the whole thing together. And, of course, we did the final mix in a professional studio, but I was basically the sound department for that production. So that was great because it went on to win awards all over the world. It was like really, really a hit kind of little short film that he had there, and it established his name and it allowed him to go on and do all the other interesting things that I've done with him. So that was a great starting point for many things and a really fun project sound-wise, lots of creative sound design opportunities in there. And then, the second one that you mentioned, You Ever Hear About the Toad, is just one of many things that we've done since.
Yeah.
Basically, these are super talented animators. And one thing that Fraser accomplished is that he came in and basically started doing a series around an NFL wide receiver named Josh Gordon. And essentially, by the nature of what he did, like we would do a spot every week on this athlete's Instagram page that just basically bounced off of whatever had happened in the game that week that he was playing. And he's someone who started the season with one team, the Cleveland Browns, and ended up the season with then the best team in football, the New England Patriots. And so it was quite a dramatic season that he had. And so we had a lot of interesting material to work with, and Fraser crafted these amazing episodes. But just that series went through the professional sports world like wildfire because he immediately had upped the game of like every professional athlete's social media profile. Suddenly this player, like out of nowhere, had these great animated shorts appearing every week, that would sort of talk about what they did. So suddenly everyone was all over Fraser wanting to, do different projects, and he had to just really say yes to only a few of them and turn the rest down because it wasn't a big enough studio to just churn out all this stuff. So along the way, he made contact with other professional athletes, including the former heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson. Someone on his podcast was a retired NFL offensive tackle, this guy named Eben Britton, and he was Mike Tyson's co-host on his podcast, and he became aware of this series around Josh Gordon. And that same season, we ended up doing things for Julian Edelman, another receiver on that team, and we ended up doing a Super Bowl spot for the New England Patriots, basically, So they saw all this stuff, and they said, man, it would be cool if, and he got into talks right away with that whole team. And so what had happened in that world of Mike Tyson is that he had descended into a really, really terrible state of mind after his boxing career. He was like profoundly depressed and just pretty much clinically almost non-functional. And they tried to get this whole thing together, like they established a cannabis company because he's someone that's promoted the benefits of cannabis smoking for many, many years. So it's kind of a natural that he would create his brands, such a well-known figure that they could. So they created this cannabis company, but there was also this kind of social media aspect, the podcast, all these different things that they did. So they got into talks with Fraser, and Fraser proposed, what if we do something about Mike's transformational experience with the toad, which is basically the venom of the Sonoran desert toad that's a very, very powerful hallucinogenic, along the lines of what, say, ayahuasca is, but that much more intense. And so because Tyson was in such a horrible place, one of his early podcast guests was this shaman type of guy from Mexico. And he started talking about this hallucinogenic, transformational, incredible experience that people had with this toad venom, and with the right kind of guide to these experiences, people's lives turned around. And it ended up being the case with Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson did it several times, and he suddenly saw life and the universe and the meaning of everything in this completely different type of way. And you can literally see him. You can go back to the old podcasts, and he's sitting there practically catatonic. You can see the guy's in a horrible place. Once he's done this toad, it's like the guy's eyes have opened up, his face has opened up, the energy coming out of him. And so we created that short that kind of commemorated that, and we were allowed the audio from the podcast so we could have Mike Tyson's own voice in it. And so I went through all of those early podcasts, and I just extracted any clean audio, like coming from Mike Tyson himself, where he said this or said that, because it was all potential things that Fraser could use in scripts. And so we ended up putting this thing together, and, out of it, Fraser has done a number of other things with him, and we still have hopes of collaborating with that whole world of Mike Tyson and his entourage, because he means a lot to the director, who's been a boxing fan all of his life, and he considers Mike Tyson to be one of the true greats. And just his story and everything about him is so exciting to this director that I've still got my fingers crossed. We created a longer version. Initially, it was a 1-minute Instagram spot by definition. The public Instagram is limited to 1 minute. But he created a 2.5 minute of the same thing that sort of expanded it. And Tyson has seen that and just been over the moon. And so we know there's a connection there. And it's just very interesting to be moving in this world of professional athletes, some of whom are that famous and doing work for them. It's a pretty incredible experience.
It's insane.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's
Absolutely.
so cool. Wow.
Oh, man. After watching the video of You Ever Hear About the Toad, you definitely hear and see the hallucinogenic, I guess, for lack of a better term, you can feel all the elements in the film.
Well, then I did an okay job, right?
You did an excellent job, is what I'm saying.
Because
the sound was designed.
Well, that's it. I mean, and remember, I'm working every step of the way with the director, and he's got really strong feelings. He's not able to execute any of the stuff, but if it doesn't fit with what he's doing, he tells me right away, and I try something else. And sometimes we go through 6 or 7 different ideas before we come on the one that he figures is going to work. And, you know, the Tyson projects have been no exception to that rule. And so, you know, very dynamic, very exciting environment to be working in.
Right.
That's so cool to talk about this. I'm just like in a state of
definitely.
Like, wow. Thank you.
I'm actually really curious. How is it like just working directly with a director? What is the freedom like when you're creating audio? Do you have opportunity to express your art, like pitch ideas or...
Yeah, with Fraser, it's happily not that way. I mean, I've told you about all these other projects where I had complete latitude, and that was very fun in its own way.
Yeah.
But with him, it's anything but. He knows what he wants. He always knows what he wants. Only once in a while will he say, you know, I confess I don't have an idea. Just try some stuff, and I'll tell you if I like it or not. And it'll be yes or no. But no, it's usually very specific. I work a lot with models. He'll say, you know, listen to this YouTube at 139. It's that kind of thing I'm looking for. And I'll say, okay, you know, and my whole parametric thinking that I drilled you folks in the composition course you took with me at Concordia, I'm using that all the time. Because you listen and you say, okay, what is it he wants? He wants this kind of rising gesture, and it's kind of like more of a whooshy noise than having any pitch in it. If that's in his model, that's what I'm going to work up as a draft to play for him. And then he'll say, yeah, that's along the right line, but maybe it could be also a little bit like this, and he'll send me another model, and I say, okay, that's got a little bit of a pitched quality to it, so maybe I can make that rising sort of spectral gesture a little bit resonant, so there's a bit of pitch in it, and maybe that'll fly, and maybe it won't. It goes back and forth like that about 1,000,000 times, you know, in all kinds of different ways, and I like that. It requires a type of discipline that when you've got someone with a strong vision and who's always coming up with stuff that's absolutely off the wall great, then you say, man, he knows. I'm working for him. And I'm happy to just give him the best version of what he's maybe hearing. And I'll always end up with something of mine in there for sure, of my own. And we've just arrived at these things. He'll often give to me a model of a previous episode we did. He'll say, remember what you did, you know, in week 5 of the Gordon series? At that particular point, that's the kind of thing I'm looking for here. And so that's easy because I'll go back to my old sessions and I'll say, okay, that's what he's talking about. I'll just import those tracks into my other session and use those. So when we're like in full collaborative mode, there's nothing like it, really. I do a lot of cool things and I do a lot of really interesting things, but sound design in the collaborative context, I don't see the hours go by. It's just like, what? It's 9 o'clock at night. It's 11 o'clock at night. It's 1 a.m. Like, what happened? Because I'm so in there.
Right. It's always nice to have that clear direction. I think this is actually a perfect place to end our incredible chat that we had, our little discussion. But before we conclude, there's a little tradition that we created here on Soundspace, and it's that we ask our guests one final question. So my final question to you is, what is your advice to people who want to get into the space of sound?
Yeah, I like the question. And I like the fact that other people will have answered it, and you can kind of compare my answer to what other people have said.
Yeah, it's great because everybody always answers something different, and it's interesting to hear what everyone has to say.
Yeah. So my answer is keep the focus on the miraculousness of sound. Every sound we hear is like a little miracle. When you start knowing what's going on in our hearing apparatus, automatically, without us thinking about it, any kind of audio perception is just this little miracle that's happening. And when you open your ears and you just have that sense of awe of the whole world of sound, that sort of range of vibrations that are coming into your ears, it keeps you in this space towards it that's almost reverent in a way. And when you combine that with digging into all the deep and the rich history of music and sound design and movie making and all these different cultural wrinkles and contexts, that's what keeps you excited about it. It keeps you fresh. and it keeps you motivated to your max in every single project. That's my experience, and that's my answer.
Perfect.
Great answer. Great answer.
Can I just say thank you so much for coming on? Thank you so much for sharing your stories, your knowledge with Jaian and myself and everyone who will listen to this podcast. We just really appreciate it very much.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. You guys have like 2-hour plus podcasts because you got a lot of material there.
Yeah, typically.
Yeah. We've had we go around this time. It varies between an hour and a half. We've had one that went over 3 hours. So
Okay.
we're long form. We're definitely long form. We're in the right timing. Sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Make sure to go follow all of Michael's projects, such as poetryofjazz.ca, where you can find out more about his jazz projects. There will be audio samples, lyrics of the band over there. You can go to trajectories.net. On that website, you will find more information for the Blood and Breath album, as well as the Video Etude series over there. And lastly, thoroughbred.ca. All of the audio on that website is Michael's work. You can find it all on the work tab over there. Thoroughbred, which is spelled THOROUGHBREAD. So all of those websites will give you an idea as to what he is working on. Once again, poetryofjazz.ca, trajectories.net, and thoroughbred.ca.
And all of that will be linked in all our platforms. You can find me on Instagram at akachi.audio. That's ACACI.audio. And you can find me on Spotify at Akachi. My website is still in the works, so when that is complete, that will be linked as well.
Perfect. You can follow the podcast Soundspace in your favorite podcatcher. All of our social media will be linked in the description: Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as YouTube and SoundCloud. And the art for this podcast is done by GoPro Keo, so please go give him a follow on Twitter. And for myself, JaianMusic.com is my website, my first name and music.com, and it will link to everything else that I do. And my @ on social media is Jaian Music. So for myself, Michael, and Anthony, this has been another episode of Soundspace. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.